If you've ever had a boss who confused shouting for leadership or who thought a title gave them a license for cruelty, then you know exactly what I'm talking about. Stick around because this is a story about how the most toxic boss I ever had became the star of his own downfall. If you want to see how it all played out, and for more stories about getting the last word, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you don't miss a thing. My name is Jared, and for 22 years I was a ghost. Not a literal one, of course. I was the vice president of internal communications for a global logistics firm, a title that sounds important until you realize your main job is to be the corporate soul. I wrote the speeches that made new hires feel welcome, designed the campaigns that made 1,000-page policy changes feel human, and built the narratives that held the company's culture together. I was the institutional memory, the quiet architect of the story we told ourselves about who we were. I was good at it. I was so good at it, in fact, that my work became invisible, a seamless part of the corporate machine. The machine ran smoothly, so no one ever thought to look at the guy who kept it oiled. That was my normal. Then Trevor arrived. Trevor wasn't from our world. He was a private equity guy, brought in as the new chief operating officer after a major investor shook up the board. He was all sharp suits, gleaming teeth, and an MBA from a school he mentioned within the first 5 minutes of any conversation. He walked into our comfortable, established, and frankly successful corporate culture like a demolition ball through a stained glass window. He called our way of doing things stagnant. He called our emphasis on employee retention a cost center. And he called his own management style, with a completely straight face, motivational intensity. What it really was high-volume verbal abuse. He was a screamer, a desk pounder, a man who seemed to think that fear was a key performance indicator. The incident that set everything in motion was, in itself, pathetically small. It was a Tuesday morning meeting about the quarterly internal newsletter, a tradition I had started 15 years prior. It was simple, effective, and people actually read it. Trevor, who had been with the company for all of 6 months, decided it was lacking synergistic impact. He wanted to replace it with a series of mandatory, unskippable video announcements starring himself. I tried to explain calmly that engagement data showed our employees preferred the readable format, that video announcements often got muted and ignored. He didn't like that. His face, usually a mask of smug confidence, began to turn a blotchy, dangerous red. He pointed a finger at me, his hand trembling slightly. He told me, in front of my own team and 2 other department heads, that my legacy mindset was an anchor dragging the company down. He said I was allergic to innovation, and that my refusal to embrace a dynamic content paradigm was bordering on insubordination. He was shouting by the end of it, spittle flying from his mouth. I just stood there, my hands clasped behind my back, and said, "I understand your perspective, Trevor. I will draft a proposal for the video series." My calmness, as it always did, seemed to infuriate him even more. That was the beginning of the end. He had marked me as a target. 3 weeks later, I was called into a conference room I had personally helped design. The frosted glass walls, meant to feel open and collaborative, suddenly felt like an interrogation chamber. Trevor was there, along with a woman from human resources I'd never met before. She had a practiced plastic smile and a folder in front of her. Trevor, for his part, looked smug. He couldn't even meet my eye. He just stared at a point on the wall just over my shoulder. The HR woman, whose name was something like Brenda or Barbara, slid a single sheet of paper across the polished table. It was a performance review. A review I had never seen, filled with fabricated complaints and metrics I had supposedly failed to meet. It cited a failure to integrate modern communication strategies, a negative and resistant attitude toward leadership directives, and my personal favorite, a demonstrated lack of executive presence. 22 years of flawless reviews, of commendations, of successfully navigating the company through mergers, downturns, and public relations crises, all wiped away by a 6-month tenure of a man who thought leadership was a synonym for yelling. I was being terminated, effective immediately, for cause, no severance. My vested stock options were suddenly a matter of legal review. My pension, which was set to fully mature in 3 years, was gone. Just like that. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I looked at Trevor, who was still avoiding my gaze, and then at the HR woman. I nodded slowly. And then I had the idea. It was a spark, a beautiful, perfect, and terrible idea that bloomed in the ruins of my career. I cleared my throat. I told him that while I was disappointed by the decision, I respected it. I told him that before I left, I had one final project I felt a duty to complete. I said that in my short time working under his leadership, I had been incredibly impressed by his motivational intensity. I told him the company was rolling out a new series of leadership training modules and that they were looking for authentic, powerful examples of modern management. I said his unique leadership style was exactly what they were looking for. I asked if before I was escorted out, he would be willing to let me film him demonstrating some of his techniques. A sort of day-in-the-life masterclass. Flattery, I knew, was Trevor's native language. His ego was a cavernous, empty thing that devoured praise. His eyes lit up. The smugness returned tenfold. He puffed out his chest and looked at the HR woman as if to say, "See? Even the guy I'm firing recognizes my genius." He agreed instantly. He said it was a brilliant idea. He told HR to give us an hour. He wanted to make sure, he said, that his legacy was properly documented. And that right there was the moment the hook was set. He had no idea he wasn't documenting his legacy. He was filming his own corporate execution. The walk back to my desk felt like moving through water. My team, a small group of 3 people I had hired and mentored myself, looked up at me with wide, worried eyes. They had heard the rumors, seen the writing on the wall. Chloe, the youngest, a brilliant graphic designer I'd poached from a competitor, looked like she was about to cry. I gave them a small, tight smile that I hoped was reassuring, though it felt like a skull's grin on my face. Security was already there. A man named Frank, who I'd shared beers with at the company Christmas party for a decade. He looked deeply uncomfortable. He said, "Jared, I'm so sorry." I just nodded and told him it was okay, that I understood he had a job to do. While he stood awkwardly by, I began to pack my things. Not the personal photos, not the cheap trophies from corporate golf tournaments. I packed the tools of my trade, my personal notebooks filled with 2 decades of ideas, contacts, and strategies. As I did this, the full weight of the betrayal began to settle in my bones, a cold, heavy thing. 22 years. I had given this company my prime. I'd worked late nights, missed school plays, and canceled vacations to handle one crisis or another. I had believed in the mission. I had been a company man, a term that now tasted like ash in my mouth. My loyalty hadn't been an asset. It had been a vulnerability. They hadn't seen a dedicated employee. They had seen a fixed cost that could be easily cut. Competence isn't cheap until you lose it. They were about to learn that lesson the hard way. When I got home, the silence of my empty house was deafening. My wife was at work, my kids grown and gone. I walked into my study, the room where I had taken countless late-night calls for the company, and just stood in the middle of the floor. The adrenaline from the confrontation had faded, leaving behind a hollow, vibrating emptiness. It wasn't just anger. It was a profound sense of disillusionment. I poured myself a glass of bourbon, the good stuff I saved for special occasions. I suppose getting fired after 2 decades counted as one. I sat in my leather chair and stared out the window, watching the suburban world go on, completely oblivious to the fact that my own had just been dynamited. The past came rushing back, not in gentle waves of nostalgia, but as a series of sharp, painful snapshots. I remembered my first day, the nervous energy, the sense of limitless possibility. I remembered Mr. Henderson, the founder, a tough but fair man who knew every employee by name. He'd once told me, "Jared, the people are the company, everything else is just furniture." Henderson had retired 5 years ago, and his absence was a cancer that had allowed men like Trevor to metastasize within the organization. I remembered the merger 10 years back. It was a bloodbath. The acquiring company wanted to slash and burn, to gut our departments and absorb the assets. I'd worked for 72 hours straight, crafting the internal communication strategy that saved hundreds of jobs. I'd built a narrative of synergistic partnership instead of hostile takeover. I'd personally briefed the new executives, showing them the value in our people, in our culture, and it had worked. I'd saved the very soul of the company, and my reward was a $500 gift card and a brief mention in the quarterly newsletter I myself had written. At the time, I'd felt proud. Now it just felt pathetic. I had been a fool, a loyal dog wagging its tail for a pat on the head while the owners calculated the cost of my food. And then I thought about Trevor. My mind replayed a highlight reel of his 6 months of terror. There was the time he'd humiliated Chloe in a full-team meeting. She had presented a new design concept for an internal safety campaign. It was brilliant, modern, and engaging. Trevor had let her finish her entire 20-minute presentation before he'd spoken. He'd leaned back in his chair, steepled his fingers, and said loud enough for the entire floor to hear, "Is this a joke? It looks like something my daughter would draw, in crayon." The color drained from Chloe's face. She stood there frozen in front of the projection of her own work. I had stepped in, of course. I'd said, "Actually, Trevor, the design is based on proven modern aesthetics that test extremely well with the under 30 demographic, which makes up 60% of our warehouse staff. It's an excellent piece of targeted communication." I'd defended her, but the damage was done. Trevor had just glared at me, his message clear: "Your loyalty is to me, not to them." I remembered another incident just a month ago. I'd developed a comprehensive crisis communication plan for a potential supply chain disruption. It was a proactive measure, a 200-page document that covered every conceivable contingency. I'd spent weeks on it, consulting with logistics, legal, and international partners. I submitted it to Trevor for his review. 2 days later, during the executive leadership meeting, he presented the plan as his own. He'd literally taken my file, put his name on the cover sheet, and presented my words, my strategies, as his proactive leadership initiative. I sat in that meeting, listening to him butcher the finer points, mispronounce the names of our key overseas contacts, and take credit for my labor. The CEO had praised him for his foresight, and I had said nothing. Why? That was the question that was screaming in my head now, in the silence of my study. Why had I tolerated it? Was it loyalty, or was it cowardice? I'd told myself I was protecting my team, that I was the buffer between them and him. I absorbed his rage so they wouldn't have to. I fixed his mistakes before they could cause real damage. I was playing the long game, I'd thought, waiting for him to implode. But in the end, I wasn't a buffer. I was an enabler. My silence had been mistaken for acceptance. My competence had given him a safety net. As I nursed my second bourbon, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Chloe. It just said, "I'm so sorry, Jared. This is completely unfair. He's already trying to get into your project files for the Atlas rebranding. He can't figure out the password protection." The Atlas rebranding. That was my magnum opus. A year-long project to completely overhaul the company's internal branding, from its mission statement to its digital interface. It was a massive, complex undertaking, and I had been the sole architect. Trevor had been salivating over it, seeing it as his chance to make his mark, to present a huge win to the board and secure his position, and he couldn't even get past the first layer of security on the draft files. A small, cruel smile touched my lips for the first time that day. Another text from Chloe came through a minute later. "He's yelling at IT, he's demanding they break the encryption. They're telling him only the file creator can do that." That was the catalyst. It wasn't just my own pain anymore. It was the thought of him, this incompetent brute, taking my best work and twisting it into some monstrous, ego-driven spectacle. It was the thought of him continuing to terrorize good people like Chloe. The quiet, simmering anger in my chest began to cool, to harden into something else. It became a cold, clear, and absolute resolve. The plan I had pitched in that conference room, the one born of desperate, panicked inspiration, now seemed like a work of genius. It was perfect. It wasn't just revenge, it was justice. It would use his own greatest weapon, his toxic, abusive personality, against him. And it would use his greatest weakness, his monumental ego, as the delivery system. I finished my drink, the warmth spreading through me, chasing away the last of the hollow shock. I stood up and walked over to my desk. I pulled out a fresh legal pad and a pen. At the top of the page I wrote 2 words, "training module." It was time to write the script for Trevor's final performance. The first step was to lay the groundwork, to ensure that when the trap sprung, it would be flawless and inescapable. The foundation of any successful operation is planning. My entire career had been about managing perception and controlling narratives, and this was going to be my masterpiece. I spent the next 2 days in a state of hyper-focused activity. The grief and shock had been transmuted into pure, cold strategy. First, I needed to make sure my own flank was covered. I called a friend of mine, a lawyer named Marcus, who specialized in employment law. I'd known Marcus since college, we'd kept in touch, and I'd sent a fair amount of business his way over the years from friends and colleagues who'd found themselves in sticky situations. I laid out the whole story for him, from Trevor's arrival to the fabricated performance review to my termination for cause. Marcus listened patiently, a series of grunts his only response. When I was done, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Jared, they've made a colossal mistake. Firing a 22-year veteran for cause without a documented paper trail of progressive discipline, especially this close to your pension vesting, that's a wrongful termination suit waiting to happen. They're either arrogant, incompetent, or both." I told him it was definitely both. "The for cause termination is likely a scare tactic," he continued, "a way to deny you severance and hope you just go away quietly. The fact that they're holding your vested options for review is also a major red flag." Then I told him about my idea, the training video. I expected him to laugh or tell me it was a crazy emotional reaction. Instead, he was silent again. Then I heard him let out a low whistle. "That's not just revenge, Jared," he said, his voice tinged with what sounded like admiration. "That's a work of art, but you have to be careful. The execution has to be perfect." We spent the next hour wargaming it. Marcus's advice was invaluable. First, the equipment. It had to be company property. If I used my own camera, they could claim I had created the recording under false pretenses. But if it was their equipment, on their premises, at the request of a COO, the lines of ownership and consent became beautifully blurred. Second, the distribution. Who was the target audience? I'd initially thought of sending it to the CEO. Marcus corrected me. "No," he said, "the CEO likely hired Trevor, or at least sanctioned his appointment. He has a vested interest in sweeping this under the rug. You need to go over his head. You work for a global company, right?" I confirmed. "Then you find the global head of human resources, the big boss, the one who sits in the corporate headquarters in Zurich or London. That person has no personal loyalty to Trevor and a massive professional obligation to mitigate corporate liability. An unhinged COO creating a hostile work environment is a multi-million-dollar lawsuit waiting to happen. You're not just giving them evidence of misconduct, you're handing them a solution to a problem they might not even know they have." That was the key. I wasn't being a disgruntled employee. I was being a responsible corporate citizen, reporting a significant risk. The framing was everything. My next call was to Chloe. I needed an inside woman, and she was the perfect choice. She was loyal to me, she despised Trevor, and she was smart enough to understand the stakes. I explained the plan to her, carefully, making sure she knew she could say no, that there was a risk. She didn't even hesitate. "Jared, just tell me what you need," she said, her voice filled with a fierce energy I hadn't heard from her before. "After what he did to you, after how he's been treating everyone, I'll do anything to help." She became my field operative. Her first mission was to secure the equipment. As a graphic designer, she had legitimate access to the comms department's high-end camera and audio gear. She signed out the best DSLR camera, a lapel microphone, and a tripod, citing a special project for the COO's office. No one batted an eye. Trevor's name was a magic key that opened any door, his aura of menace ensuring no one asked too many questions. Chloe also became my eyes and ears, feeding me crucial intel on the secondary front of my war, the Atlas rebranding project. This was a critical subplot. My revenge wasn't just about exposing Trevor's abusive nature, it was about proving my own irreplaceability. It was about demonstrating the value of quiet competence. Chloe's updates were a litany of disasters. Trevor, having failed to break my encryption, had ordered the IT department to rebuild the core assets from scratch. He had no understanding of the project's complexity, the interwoven brand architecture, the market research data, the complex digital framework. He was trying to build a skyscraper by looking at a napkin sketch. He'd held a kickoff meeting with the design team where, according to Chloe, he'd used the word synergy 17 times and presented a vision board he'd clearly thrown together in PowerPoint using clip art. He'd rejected all their professional feedback, insisting on a color palette of black and gold because it looked powerful. Chloe sent me a screenshot of the new logo concept. It was hideous, a clunky, garish monstrosity that looked like a logo for a cheap casino. The team hated it. Morale, she said, had cratered. The project was already weeks behind schedule and burning through its budget with pointless revisions. Every update was another piece of evidence, another testament to the chaos that ensues when arrogance replaces experience. Competence isn't a line item on a budget, it's the entire damn building. With the logistics handled, I focused on the most important part of the plan, the bait. I needed to craft the perfect pitch to get Trevor in that room on camera and performing his heart out. I spent an entire afternoon drafting and redrafting a one-page proposal, a document of pure, unadulterated flattery. I filled it with the kind of corporate jargon he loved. It wasn't a training video, it was a leadership intellectual property capture session. We weren't filming his techniques, we were documenting a paradigm of high-impact management for future scalability. The goal was to create an evergreen training asset that would codify his unique methodology. It was nonsense, a word salad of business school buzzwords, but I knew it would be like catnip to him. I was building him a throne out of his own vanity. I knew him. I knew he saw himself as a corporate visionary, a Jack Welch for the modern age. He didn't think he was an abusive manager, he thought he was a tough, effective leader, and the world was just too soft to appreciate him. My proposal offered him the validation he craved. It told him he was right. It told him he was a star. I emailed the proposal to his personal address with the subject line, Proposal, the Trevor Brandolini Leadership Module. I hit send, and the trap was officially set. All I had to do now was wait for the bear to walk into it. The phone rang less than 10 minutes after I sent the email. It was Trevor. His tone wasn't that of a man talking to someone he'd just fired. It was eager, almost conspiratorial. "Jared, my man," he boomed, the forced bonhomie grating on my nerves. "I'm looking at your proposal. This is brilliant, absolutely brilliant." I played my part, keeping my voice neutral, professional. I told him I was glad he saw the value in it. Value? This is legacy, Jared. Leadership, intellectual property. I love it. It's exactly the kind of forward thinking I've been trying to inject into this place. He had already taken ownership of the idea, of my carefully chosen words. It was happening exactly as I had predicted. We spent 20 minutes on the phone as he waxed lyrical about his own genius. He talked about his core principles of radical accountability and disruptive motivation. He was essentially outlining the very behaviors I wanted to capture on film. He was so caught up in his own hype that he didn't even question why I, the man he'd just unceremoniously canned, was the one orchestrating his moment of glory. In his mind, it made perfect sense. Of course I would recognize his greatness. Everyone did. We set the time and place, Friday afternoon in conference room 4B, the one with the best natural light. He told me to be ready to capture lightning in a bottle. He wanted the session to be an hour long. He even sent me a follow-up email with a bulleted list of topics he wanted to cover, which was essentially a menu of his greatest abusive hits, delivering high-impact feedback, managing underperformers, and driving a performance-oriented culture. I forwarded the email to my personal account and sent a copy to Marcus's office. It was a written confirmation of his enthusiastic consent. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. All the gears were aligned. The plan was in motion. I felt a strange sense of calm descend over me. There was no rage anymore, just a quiet, humming certainty. I was no longer a victim of circumstance. I was a director, and the stage was set for the final act. Trevor was about to give the performance of a lifetime, and I was going to make sure it had the audience it deserved. The day of the filming arrived, cloaked in the gray, drizzly sky of a typical Friday morning. I dressed not in the suit of a former executive, but in the functional, unassuming clothes of a cameraman, a black polo shirt, dark jeans, comfortable shoes. I was a technician, a facilitator. My role was to be invisible. Chloe had done her job perfectly. When I arrived at the office building, I wasn't an ex-employee, I was a consultant for the COO's office. She had put my name on the visitor list, and the security guard at the front desk, a new guy who didn't know me, waved me through with a nod. Walking through those halls, the halls I had walked for over 2 decades, was a surreal experience. It was my world, but I was a stranger in it. People I knew averted their eyes, whispering to each other as I passed. They knew I'd been fired. My presence was a mystery, a disruption to the natural order. They didn't know whether to approach me or avoid me. I offered no clues, just a polite, neutral expression as I made my way to conference room 4B. Chloe was already there, setting up the camera. The room was sterile and impersonal, all white walls and brushed steel. The long mahogany table gleamed under the recessed lighting. It was the perfect stage, a corporate non-space where humanity came to die. Chloe had the camera on a tripod, positioned at the head of the table where Trevor would sit. A second, smaller camera, a GoPro from the kit, was placed discreetly on the credenza, capturing a wider angle. A redundancy. I always believed in redundancies. The lapel mic was clipped to a bottle of water at his designated seat. She looked nervous, her hands fidgeting with a lens cap. I gave her a reassuring look. "You did great, Chloe," I said quietly. "Just act as my assistant, run the sound check, and when he starts, you can find a reason to leave. You don't need to see this." She nodded, a wave of relief washing over her face. "He sent out a memo this morning," she whispered, announcing the imminent launch of the new Atlas branding. He attached the logo. "People are not happy." I almost smiled. The fire was spreading. Trevor made his entrance precisely at 2 o'clock. He didn't walk in, he strode in, radiating an energy that was both magnetic and repellent. He was wearing one of his most expensive suits, a navy pinstripe that probably cost more than my first car. He'd had his hair professionally styled. He was ready for his close-up. "Jared, let's make some magic," he boomed, clapping me on the shoulder a little too hard. He glanced at the setup, impressed. "Looks professional. I like it." I introduced Chloe as my technical assistant. He barely acknowledged her, his focus entirely on himself and the camera lens. I went through the motions, attaching the lapel mic to his tie, explaining that it would capture his voice with perfect clarity. He puffed out his chest, enjoying the attention. I asked him to state his name and the date for the record, for cataloging purposes. "Trevor Brandolini, Chief Operating Officer," he declared, his voice full of self-importance. "Date is October 26th. This is the first session of the Brandolini Leadership Axiom series." He'd already renamed it. Of course he had. The plan was for me to play the role of the underperforming subordinate. He would demonstrate his techniques on me. It was a sick piece of theater, but one he had unknowingly co-authored. I took my seat opposite him. The red recording light on the camera blinked on. I gave him a nod. The show began. For the next hour, I was subjected to the full force of his motivational intensity. It was even worse than I had remembered, because this time it was a performance. He was leaning into the role, exaggerating his own worst tendencies for the benefit of his imaginary audience. He started with delivering high-impact feedback. He pulled out a copy of my last project proposal, the one he had approved before firing me, and proceeded to tear it to shreds. He didn't critique it, he savaged it. He called my writing pedestrian, my ideas tepid, and my strategic vision myopic. He circled paragraphs with a thick red marker, slamming the pen down on the table for emphasis. This right here," he shouted, jabbing a finger at a sentence. "This is the kind of weak, passive language that kills companies. There's no energy, no disruption. It's pathetic." He moved on to managing underperformers. He leaned in close, his voice dropping to a theatrical, menacing growl. He accused me of being lazy, of coasting, of being dead weight. He told me that in his old world on Wall Street, I would have been chewed up and spat out before breakfast. He told me my 22 years of service weren't a sign of loyalty, but of stagnation. "You think because you've been here forever, you're entitled to a job," he sneered. "That's not how the world works anymore, pal. You're a dinosaur. And you know what happens to dinosaurs? Extinction." Throughout it all, I remained perfectly still. I kept my expression neutral, my hands folded on the table in front of me. I was a blank canvas onto which he could project all his rage and insecurity. My calmness was a silent rebellion, and it drove him to new heights of fury. He wanted a reaction. He wanted me to break, to argue, to cry. I gave him nothing, and my nothingness was a vacuum that he felt compelled to fill with more and more venom. The final segment was his masterpiece, driving a performance-oriented culture. For this, he stood up and began to pace behind his chair like a caged animal. He launched into a tirade about accountability. He threatened my job I no longer had, at least a dozen times. He threatened to demote me, to slash my budget, to reassign my team. He belittled me, using my age as a weapon. "Maybe you're just tired, Jared. Maybe you've lost the fire in your belly. Well, I'm here to light a fire under your ass." He pounded his fist on the table, rattling the water glasses. "From now on, every project will be measured, every deliverable will be scrutinized, and anyone who can't keep up will be cut loose. No exceptions, no excuses. That's how you build a dynasty." He was red-faced, sweating under the lights, his eyes wild. He was completely lost in the performance, a man high on his own supply of vitriol. He genuinely believed he was creating a motivational classic, a masterclass in strong leadership. I just had to sit there and take it. Every insult a golden nugget of evidence, every threat another nail in his coffin. The hour felt like a lifetime. When he finally ran out of steam, he slumped back into his chair, breathing heavily, a triumphant smirk on his face. "Well," he asked, panting slightly, "did you get all that? Was that intense enough for you?" I allowed myself a small, respectful nod. "Yes, Trevor," I said, my voice even. "I think we got exactly what we needed." The fallout from the training video was not a loud explosion, but a quiet, creeping tide. After Trevor's bravura performance, I packed up the equipment with methodical calm. He clapped me on the back again, telling me to send him a rough cut as soon as possible. I assured him I would. I met Chloe in the lobby. I handed her the SD cards. "Copy everything," I told her. "Make 2 backups, keep one off-site, then put the originals in an inner office envelope addressed to me. Mail it to my house." She understood immediately. This was about chain of custody. No one could ever claim I had tampered with the footage. The original unaltered files would come directly from the company's internal mail system. I went home, and for the first time in days I slept soundly. The next Monday morning, I sat at my desk in my home office, a cup of coffee in hand. I had the video files open on my laptop. I didn't edit a single frame. I didn't add music or titles. I created a new email. In the To field, I typed the name Marcus had given me, Eleanor Vance, Global Head of Human Resources. Her profile on the company's website showed a stern-looking woman in her 60s with a formidable reputation. Her office was in the global headquarters in London. She was, for all intents and purposes, the company's conscience and its executioner. The subject line of the email was simple: urgent, a matter of corporate risk and liability. In the body, I was brief and professional. I introduced myself and my tenure. I explained that I had recently been terminated and that my former manager, COO Trevor Brandolini, had requested I film a session to document his unique leadership style for a potential training module. I wrote, "I believe the enclosed, unedited footage demonstrates a leadership methodology that exposes the company to significant legal and financial risk. As a loyal employee of 22 years, I felt it was my duty to bring this to your direct attention." I attached the 1-hour video file. It took several minutes to upload. My heart was pounding, a slow, heavy drumbeat in my chest. I took a deep breath, hovered the cursor over the send button for a second, and then I clicked. The Rubicon was crossed. For 2 days, there was only silence. It was a nerve-wracking quiet. I started to second-guess myself. What if Marcus was wrong? What if Eleanor Vance was one of them, a part of the old boys' network who would protect her own? What if she just deleted the email? My only source of information was Chloe, who reported a strange and tense atmosphere at the office. Trevor was strutting around like a king, telling anyone who would listen about the groundbreaking leadership series he was producing. He was also, according to Chloe, growing increasingly frustrated with the Atlas rebranding. The design team was in open revolt, a quiet rebellion of missed deadlines and technical difficulties. The project was grinding to a halt, a victim of his own incompetence. He was getting angrier, more volatile. His motivational intensity was ratcheting up, no longer a performance but a constant state of being. The first sign that the tide was turning came on Wednesday afternoon. Chloe called me, her voice a hushed, excited whisper. "Jared, something's happening. 2 people from corporate HR just showed up. Not our local HR, these are different. They look serious. They went straight into a conference room with the regional president." An hour later, she called back. "They're interviewing people, one by one. They just called in my manager. They asked me for a list of everyone on the comms team, past and present." The investigation had begun. Eleanor Vance was not a woman who wasted time. The video had not been deleted. It had been a bomb, and the shockwave was spreading silently through the upper echelons of the company. The panic started on Thursday. Trevor must have gotten wind of the investigation. He called me, his voice stripped of its earlier bravado. It was tight, laced with a fear he was trying desperately to conceal. "Jared, what did you do?" he asked. No preamble, no greeting. I played dumb. "I'm not sure what you mean, Trevor. I've just been unpacking my life's work from a cardboard box. To what do I owe the pleasure?" "Don't play games with me," he hissed. "HR is here. They're asking questions. About me, about you. Did you say something to them? I haven't spoken to anyone, Trevor, I said calmly. I simply forwarded the training module we created, just as you asked. I sent it up the chain for approval. Is there a problem? There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could hear his labored breathing. He was connecting the dots. The training module, the arrival of corporate HR. He had walked into the cage, and the door had just slammed shut behind him. You set me up, he whispered, his voice a mixture of disbelief and fury. You son of a bitch, you set me up. I just sent them the training module you approved, Trevor, I repeated, my voice as flat and emotionless as a dial tone. The one you yourself art-directed. The one you wanted for your legacy. He started screaming then, a torrent of threats and accusations. He was going to sue me for defamation. He was going to ruin me. He would make sure I never worked in this industry again. It was the desperate rage of a trapped animal. I listened patiently until he was done. Then I said very quietly, "It's a little late for motivational intensity, don't you think?" And I hung up. The power had shifted. He knew it, and I knew it. The man who had held my entire professional life in his hands was now completely, utterly powerless. And the beauty of it was, I hadn't done a thing. I had simply let him be himself, and given him a mirror. The final act of Trevor's corporate drama was swift and brutal. On Friday morning, exactly 1 week after he had filmed his masterclass, Chloe sent me a one-line text message, "He's gone." She told me he had been called into a meeting with the 2 investigators from corporate and the regional president. He was in there for less than 10 minutes. When he came out, his face was pale, ashen. He didn't speak to anyone. He walked to his office, packed a small box with his personal effects, and was escorted out of the building by security. There was no grand announcement, no farewell email. He just vanished. Later that day, an official memo went out from Eleanor Vance's office in London. It announced that Trevor Brandolini was taking a permanent, unpaid sabbatical to pursue other opportunities. It was the most savage piece of corporate jargon I had ever seen. Permanent, unpaid sabbatical was a public execution. It was a signal to the entire global company that he had been fired in the most disgraceful way possible. There was no coming back from that. His career in any reputable firm was over. The memo also announced an immediate full-scale review of the regional office's management practices and culture, to be overseen by Ms. Vance's team personally. The king was dead. A few days later, I received a phone call from a number I didn't recognize. It had a London area code. It was Eleanor Vance. Her voice was exactly as I had imagined it, crisp, no nonsense, with an accent that could cut glass. "Mr. Jared Stone?" she asked. I confirmed it was me. "My name is Eleanor Vance. I'm the global head of human resources for the company. I'm calling first to offer you a sincere and unreserved apology on behalf of the organization. What you were subjected to was unacceptable, and your termination was a grave error in judgment." I was taken aback by the directness. There was no hedging, no corporate speak. "Second," she continued, "I want to thank you. You handled an egregious situation with a level of professionalism and strategic acumen that is frankly rare. You brought a significant liability to our attention in a way that was impossible to ignore. You may have saved this company from a multi-million-dollar class action lawsuit." She paused. The video was illuminating. I've been in HR for 30 years, and I've never seen anything quite like it. Then came the offer. They wanted me to come back. Not to my old job, but to a new, created role, Vice President of Corporate Culture and Governance, reporting directly to her. They would restore my tenure, my pension, and my stock options, fully vested. They would give me a significant raise and a budget to fix the mess Trevor had made. It was total vindication. A part of me, the old company man, was tempted, but I had changed. That loyal employee was gone, burned away in the fire of betrayal. I politely declined. I told her I appreciated the offer, but I was planning on starting my own communications consultancy. Eleanor didn't seem surprised. "I thought you might say that," she said. "In that case, would your new consultancy be willing to accept its first client? We need to fix our culture, and frankly, I think you're the only one who truly understands what's broken." And so I was hired back, but on my own terms, as a highly paid consultant, not a salaried employee. I was no longer a part of the machine. I was the mechanic they called in when it was broken. My first official recommendation, which Eleanor approved without hesitation, was the promotion of Chloe to Director of Internal Communications, my old role. She had earned it, she had the talent, the drive, and now, thanks to the power vacuum, the opportunity. Seeing her take that position was in many ways more satisfying than my own victory. My revenge hadn't just been about settling a score, it had been about restoring a semblance of balance, of justice. It was about ensuring that competence, not cruelty, was what got rewarded. The Atlas rebranding project was officially scrapped, its bloated budget written off as a total loss, a quiet, multi-million-dollar monument to Trevor's arrogance. We started over, using my original framework. It was a quiet, satisfying return to sanity. The new workplace reality was one where the loudest voice in the room was no longer the most powerful. The fear that Trevor had cultivated began to dissipate, replaced by a cautious sense of relief and renewed purpose. The ghost had returned, not as an employee but as a kingmaker, quietly rebuilding the world Trevor had tried so hard to destroy. So what's the moral of the story? It's not just about getting revenge. It's about understanding your own value, especially when the people who are supposed to recognize it don't. For years, I let my loyalty to a company blind me to the fact that the company wasn't loyal to me. I was an asset, a tool, and when a newer, shinier tool came along, I was deemed disposable. My mistake wasn't being loyal, it was misplacing that loyalty. My real assets were never my job title or my spot on the org chart. They were my experience, my relationships, and my competence. Those are things no one can ever take away from you. Trevor's mistake was thinking that his power came from his title. He was wrong. Real power isn't about shouting or threatening. It's about being so good at what you do that your absence creates a vacuum. It's about being the person the system cannot function without. Competence isn't cheap until you lose it. For all of you out there who have ever been overlooked, underestimated, or erased by a boss who values their own ego more than your contribution, my story is for you. Don't ever let anyone else define your worth. Know your value. Document everything. And sometimes the most effective form of justice isn't a loud confrontation, but a quiet, well-executed plan that allows people's own worst tendencies to become their downfall. You just have to be smart enough to build the stage, turn on the camera, and let them perform. Thank you for listening to my story. If it resonated with you, if you've ever felt that sting of being undervalued, let me know in the comments below. I read every one of them. And don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and hit that subscribe button for more stories of vindication. Until next time, know your worth.